There is a version of the Vietnam War that gets told at memorials and in textbooks and in the kind of documentaries that play on cable television at 2 in the morning. That version has a shape to it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. It has protests and politicians and a slow national reckoning that supposedly taught America something important about itself. That version is not entirely false, but it is carefully constructed. It leaves out the parts that do not fit the shape. It softens what was corrosive and explains away what was simply inexplicable. The real problem with the Vietnam War was never that it was misunderstood. The real problem was that it was misrepresented systematically, institutionally, deliberately, and in ways so pervasive that the misrepresentation eventually became the official record. Soldiers in the field understood this. They understood it not as a philosophical observation, but as a daily operational reality. The reports they filed, the incidents they witnessed, the orders they received and sometimes refused and sometimes followed against their own judgment. Those things passed upward through a chain of command and emerged at the other end as something else entirely. Numbers that did not match, conclusions that contradicted experience, victories that felt indistinguishable from defeats. This script is not about the war that was reported. It is about the war that was not. The architecture of suppression in Vietnam did not begin with a single order or a single decision. It accumulated. It built itself from thousands of small acts of institutional self-protection, career preservation, and willful blindness. It started with the way success was defined, or more precisely, the way success was made impossible to define clearly, which meant it could be defined, however, was most convenient at any given moment. Early in the American advisory period, before the large-scale commitment of ground troops, the military was already developing habits of measurement that would metastasize over the following decade. Advisors in the field were pressured to report progress. Progress meant different things to different people, but the metric that became dominant, the one that would come to define the entire American understanding of how the war was going, was the body count. It seems almost too simple to be catastrophic. Count the enemy dead. If the number goes up, you are winning. If the number goes up consistently, you are winning consistently. Present those numbers to the Secretary of Defense and to the President and to the American public, and the war has a shape again. It has momentum. It has a direction. The problem was that the body count was almost immediately corrupted, and almost everyone involved knew it, and almost no one said so in any official capacity. Units in the field faced enormous pressure to produce numbers. Commanders needed numbers to justify operations, to secure resources, to demonstrate to their superiors that their sector was producing results. Those superiors needed numbers to present to the Pentagon. The Pentagon needed numbers to present to the White House. The White House needed numbers to present to the country. At every level of this chain, there was pressure to make the numbers look better than they were, and at no level was there a reliable mechanism for verifying them. A soldier who reported killing 12 enemy combatants in a firefight could not be easily contradicted. Bodies were sometimes there and sometimes not. Sometimes they were carried away by retreating forces. Sometimes they were misidentified. Sometimes they were civilians. Sometimes they were combatants from the wrong side of a complicated political geography. The categories blurred and the numbers accumulated, and the reports went upward and became data, and the data became briefings, and the briefings became policy. There were soldiers who tried to report what was actually happening. They filed reports that contradicted the official narrative. They noted discrepancies between claimed enemy casualties and observable evidence. They reported incidents that had been classified or minimized or ignored. What happened to those reports varied. Some were quietly amended by the time they reached the next level of the chain of command. Some were returned with suggestions to revise. Some simply disappeared into the administrative machinery of the war and were never heard from again. The soldiers who filed them sometimes faced informal consequences, assignments to less desirable positions, resistance when requesting support, reputations as troublemakers or poor team players. The message was not usually delivered explicitly. It did not need to be. Everyone understood what the message was. One of the clearest early examples of systematic misreporting involved the measurement of enemy strength itself. Beginning in the mid-1960s, there was a sustained institutional effort to keep the official estimate of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese strength below a certain threshold. The reason was simple and cynical. If the enemy was too numerous, the war looked unwinnable. If the enemy was losing troops faster than they could be replaced, the war looked like it was being won. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, controlled the official order of battle, which was the document that tracked enemy strength. Analysts who produced estimates suggesting the enemy was stronger than the official figures acknowledged were pressured to revise their conclusions. When analyst Sam Adams, working for the CIA in the mid-1960s, developed evidence suggesting that enemy troop strength was dramatically higher than MACV's official count, he encountered sustained institutional resistance. His estimates were suppressed. The official figures were maintained. When the Tet Offensive of January 1968 demonstrated that the enemy had the capability to launch coordinated attacks across more than 100 locations simultaneously, the gap between the official estimate and the operational reality became impossible to conceal. But the suppression of those estimates in the years leading up to Tet meant that American commanders and American policymakers had been operating on false data. Decisions had been made based on numbers that the people producing them knew to be inaccurate. Soldiers had been deployed based on assessments of enemy capability that the assessors themselves doubted. The Tet Offensive did not come from nowhere. It came from a war that had been systematically misrepresented, and the soldiers in the field paid for that misrepresentation in the most direct way possible. The second category of events that soldiers were ordered not to report, or pressured not to report, or simply understood not to report, involved civilian casualties. This is one of the most extensively documented and most consistently minimized aspects of the entire conflict. The nature of counterinsurgency warfare in Vietnam made civilian casualties not merely possible, but structurally inevitable. The enemy operated within the civilian population. Villages provided shelter, food, and cover. The distinction between combatant and civilian was frequently impossible to determine with certainty and sometimes deliberately obscured. Free fire zones, areas designated as hostile territory where any living person could theoretically be treated as an enemy, were declared across large portions of the country. The rules of engagement shifted depending on the unit, the commander, the pressure from above, and the circumstances on the ground. In this environment, civilian deaths were constant. They happened in airstrikes that hit the wrong coordinates. They happened in artillery barrages called in on villages where enemy units were reported to be operating. They happened in ground sweeps where soldiers moved through areas designated as enemy-controlled and treated everyone present as a legitimate target. They happened in incidents that were not the result of mistakes, but of decisions. Deliberate decisions made by individuals or units operating under stress, under ambiguous orders, or under the assumption that the reporting chain would not look too closely at the results. The formal reporting requirement for civilian casualties existed on paper. In practice, reporting civilian deaths created problems. It generated paperwork. It sometimes triggered investigations. It raised questions about rules of engagement violations. It produced numbers that contradicted the narrative of precise, targeted military operations conducted against identifiable enemy forces. The simplest solution was not to report them. Enemy casualty reports would absorb the numbers. Bodies in contested areas were categorized as combatants. The administrative logic of the war demanded enemy dead, and enemy dead were produced, regardless of who had actually died. This was not a practice confined to a few units or a few commanders. It was widespread enough to be considered normalized by many soldiers who served. They did not necessarily think of it as fraud. They thought of it as how the war worked. My Lai is the incident that broke through. On the morning of March 16, 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered the hamlet of My Lai and killed somewhere between 300 and 500 civilians over the course of several hours. There were no Viet Cong in the hamlet. There were no enemy weapons. The people killed were primarily women, children, and elderly men. They were shot in groups. They were shot individually. They were shot in the irrigation ditches where soldiers had ordered them to gather. The unit reported the operation as a military success, with over 100 enemy combatants killed. The actual report that went up the chain claimed enemy dead in a firefight. There was no firefight. The report was false. The initial army investigation, triggered by a complaint from a soldier who had not participated in the killing, was closed without serious consequence. It took more than a year, and the persistence of investigative journalist Seymour Hersh before the incident became public knowledge. By the time it did, the official record had been sanitized for 18 months. The soldiers who had participated had returned home. The commanders who had received the false reports had moved on to other assignments. The Army's own investigation had been suppressed by officers who understood that allowing it to proceed would damage the institution they served. My lie was not unique. This is not a claim made carelessly. It is a claim supported by the testimony of soldiers who served in Vietnam, by the investigations conducted by the Vietnam veterans against the war, and by a substantial body of historical research conducted in the decades since the war ended. What made my lie different was not its scale relative to other incidents of deliberate civilian killing, though its scale was extraordinary. What made it different was that it became known. The other incidents did not become known, or became known only partially, or became known years later in ways that no longer carried the same consequence. There were operations conducted across the Mekong Delta and in the Central Highlands and along the coast that produced civilian casualties on a regular basis and were reported as military engagements with hostile forces. There were villages that were burned because they were suspected of providing support to the enemy, and the burning was reported as something else or not reported at all. There were individual acts of violence against civilians that soldiers witnessed and were told, explicitly or implicitly, to forget. The war produced a culture of silence around these things, not because everyone who participated was morally indifferent, but because the institutional structure rewarded silence and punished the alternative. The third category of suppressed events involved the condition of American forces themselves. By the late 1960s, the internal coherence of American military units in Vietnam was deteriorating in ways that the military's public communications did not acknowledge and that official reports consistently understated. Morale had collapsed in large portions of the force. Drug use was extensive. The use of heroin, which was available in Vietnam at low cost and high purity, spread through units with a speed and thoroughness that overwhelmed any institutional response. Estimates from the period suggest that somewhere between 10 and 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam were regular heroin users by 1970 and 1971. The actual number was probably higher, since the methodology for producing those estimates relied on self-reporting and unit-level cooperation that was itself compromised by the institutional incentive not to acknowledge the problem. A commander who reported that 20% of his unit was using heroin was reporting a failure. That report would reflect on him. The incentive was to report a smaller number, or to report the problem as under control, or not to conduct the kind of systematic assessment that would produce an accurate number at all. Drug use intersected with other forms of institutional breakdown. Racial tension within units had been building since the mid-1960s, as the draft produced a military that was disproportionately black and poor, while the officer corps remained disproportionately white. Black soldiers who had participated in the civil rights movement at home found themselves serving in a war they increasingly identified as a conflict being fought primarily by the poor for the benefit of those who were not poor, and being fought in ways that seemed to reflect the same racial hierarchies they had been challenging at home. Confrontations between black and white soldiers, sometimes violent, occurred in rear areas and in the field. Unit commanders were strongly discouraged from reporting these incidents in ways that would generate documentation of the broader pattern. Individual incidents were handled at the unit level, if they were handled at all. The systematic nature of the tension The way it reflected fundamental contradictions in what America was asking its military to do and who it was asking to do it was not something that appeared clearly in official reports. Fragging was perhaps the starkest indicator of how deeply the institution had fractured. Fragging referred to the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by enlisted soldiers, typically using fragmentation grenades, which could be deployed in ways that were difficult to attribute directly to an individual. The practice began appearing in significant numbers around 1969 and escalated through 1971. The Army's official records acknowledge 600 fragging incidents resulting in 82 deaths between 1969 and 1972. Historians and veterans groups have consistently argued that these numbers represent a substantial undercount because the incentive at every level of the command structure was to classify suspicious deaths as accidents, as combat casualties, as friendly fire incidents. Anything that would not generate a report documenting that American soldiers were killing their own officers in an organized way. The fragging phenomenon was a direct expression of a breakdown in military authority that the institution could not publicly acknowledge without undermining the credibility of the entire enterprise. Units in the field also developed practices that represented passive refusals to carry out orders, what some historians have called combat refusals, and what soldiers at the time called other things, or said nothing about at all. A patrol ordered to sweep a particular area would report back that the area had been swept without actually conducting the operation. A unit ordered to secure a hilltop would establish a perimeter short of the objective and report mission accomplished. These things happened with increasing frequency as the war extended past any point at which soldiers could connect their operational actions to a coherent strategic purpose. They happened because soldiers understood that the mission was producing casualties without producing results, and because the institutional structure of the war, which demanded compliance and reports of activity, did not provide a legitimate channel through which that understanding could be expressed. The reports that went up the chain reflected what the chain needed to receive, not what had actually occurred. The fourth category involved the conduct of the air war, which was massive in scale and largely invisible to the American public in terms of its actual effects. The bombing campaign over North Vietnam, which included Operations Rolling Thunder and Linebacker among others, was constrained by restrictions that were never publicly explained and frequently contradicted the justifications offered for the campaign. Targets were approved through a process that ran through the White House, which meant that military commanders in the field were operating under restrictions set by civilians who were themselves responding to political pressures that had nothing to do with military necessity. The frustration this generated within the military was substantial. What was reported publicly was a carefully managed account of surgical strikes against military targets conducted with precision and restraint. What was happening was something more complicated, with more civilian infrastructure being destroyed, more civilian casualties being produced, and less actual effect on North Vietnamese military capability than the official account suggested. Over Laos, the air war operated under a different and in some ways more extreme form of concealment. The bombing of Laos was, for an extended period, simply not acknowledged publicly. American aircraft were conducting thousands of sorties over Laotian territory, bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Pathet Lao positions, and not infrequently Laotian villages and civilian infrastructure. The pilots flew these missions. The ordnance was loaded and delivered. The results were assessed. None of it officially existed in terms of what was being told to the American public or to Congress. Soldiers and airmen who participated in these operations were told not to discuss them. The administrative infrastructure of the secret war in Laos was elaborate and sustained. When eventually acknowledged, the scale of the Laotian bombing campaign, ultimately producing more tonnage of ordnance than was dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II, represented a sustained institutional deception of extraordinary magnitude. Cambodia presented a similar structure. When American forces began bombing Cambodian territory in 1969, the operations were designated top secret. The crews conducting the missions were told to file false flight reports showing different coordinates, placing the aircraft over South Vietnam rather than Cambodia. Two sets of records were maintained: the falsified records that were the official documentation and the actual records that showed what had actually happened, which were kept in a separate system accessible only to those with the appropriate clearance. Soldiers involved in these operations understood, explicitly, that they were being asked to falsify official government records. The order came from the highest levels of the military and civilian command structure. It was carried out. When the bombing became public in 1970, triggering a constitutional crisis and contributing to the expansion of protests that led to the Kent state shootings, the falsification of records was acknowledged as a deliberate policy decision. The people who had made that decision explained it as a military necessity. The people who had falsified the records because they were ordered to remain largely anonymous in the official account. The fifth category of suppressed events involved the treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Conventions applied in Vietnam in theory. In practice, the treatment of prisoners depended heavily on the unit, the commander, the circumstances of capture, and the pressure of the moment. Prisoners taken in the field were sometimes killed before they could be brought to a detention facility because bringing them back created logistical complications and because dead prisoners produced body count numbers while living prisoners produced paperwork and interrogation requirements, and the risk that information extracted from them might later be scrutinized. Reports of prisoners taken in operations did not always match the operational records. Units that reported high enemy casualties with low prisoner numbers were reporting a pattern that, under the statistical logic of combat, required explanation. The explanation that made the numbers work was not always the explanation that reflected what had actually happened. Interrogation practices in the field and at detention facilities frequently involved methods that were not sanctioned by official policy and that soldiers who witnessed them were instructed not to document. The CIA's involvement in interrogation programs, particularly through the Phoenix program, which was designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, created spaces in which extraordinary violence was applied to individuals who may or may not have been what they were suspected of being. The Phoenix program formally reported over 20,000 neutralizations between 1968 and 1972. Neutralization was a bureaucratic term that could mean capture, defection, or killing. The proportion of Phoenix program neutralizations that resulted in killing, and the circumstances of those killings, was not something that the program's administrators were eager to document precisely. Soldiers and operatives who participated in Phoenix program activities were operating in a context in which the rules governing the use of lethal force were deliberately ambiguous, in which oversight was limited, and in which the pressure to produce results created incentives for violence that the official program documentation did not fully reflect. The sixth area involved the use of chemical agents and their effects. Agent Orange was the most extensive chemical operation of the Vietnam War, a defoliation campaign that ultimately covered millions of acres of Vietnamese territory with herbicide-containing dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known. The military's understanding of the health risks associated with dioxin exposure evolved over the course of the war, and as that understanding evolved, the institutional response was primarily to suppress it rather than act on it. Studies suggesting health risks were classified or shelved. Veterans who reported health problems attributable to Agent Orange exposure encountered a system that denied the connection for decades. The soldiers who had mixed and handled and been exposed to Agent Orange in the field were not warned. They were told it was safe. The information suggesting otherwise existed within the system and was not shared with them. Beyond defoliation, there were documented uses of tear gas and other chemical agents in ways that generated reports of questionable status under international law. The use of CS gas, a riot control agent, in combat operations was an area of ongoing internal debate that was resolved in practice by the operational commanders, who used it when they judged it effective, and was reported in ways that minimized the controversy surrounding it. Napalm was used extensively against targets that included villages and populated areas, and the gap between the official characterization of napalm strikes as precision operations against military targets and the actual effects of napalm on the physical environment and the people in it was one that soldiers in the field understood from direct observation and that official reports consistently papered over. The seventh area was what happened to soldiers who tried to resist. The formal mechanisms for conscientious objection existed, but were difficult to access and rarely successful. Soldiers who refused orders in the field faced court-martial. Soldiers who spoke to journalists or to anti-war organizations about what they had witnessed risked prosecution and, if still serving, faced the full weight of the institutional apparatus they were challenging. The Uniform Code of Military Justice gave commanders extensive authority to punish dissent, and that authority was used, sometimes formally and often informally. The informal punishment of soldiers who were perceived as troublemakers, reassignment, harassment, denial of promotion, the systematic undermining of their effectiveness within their units, was harder to document and harder to appeal than a formal court-martial, and in many ways, more effective as a tool of suppression. Soldiers who returned from Vietnam and spoke publicly about what they had witnessed did so at considerable personal cost. The veterans who testified at the Winter Soldier investigation in 1971, an event organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, at which over 100 veterans testified about war crimes and atrocities they had witnessed or participated in, were subjected to sustained efforts to discredit them. Some of the testimony was contested. Some of the individuals who testified had not served in the units or locations they described, and that fact was used to undermine the testimony of those who had. The institutional response to the Winter Soldier investigation was not to investigate the claims that were being made, but to attack the credibility of the people making them. The claims themselves, that civilian killings, prisoner abuse, and systematic rule of engagement violations were widespread, were not seriously investigated by the military or the government in response to the testimony. They had already been established in the internal record, in the suppressed reports and the classified investigations, and the documents that would take decades to surface through Freedom of Information Act requests and historical research. The eighth area involved the systematic manipulation of operational reporting at the unit level and above, the practice of reporting operations as more successful than they were, and of attributing enemy casualties to forces that had not produced them, or on dates when they had not been produced, was common enough to have a vocabulary within the military. Officers who were known for producing high body counts were rewarded. Officers who reported accurately but with numbers that fell short of what was expected faced questions about their effectiveness. The pressure to produce numbers that satisfied the chain of command was constant and unrelenting, and the effect of that pressure on the quality of reporting was systematic and pervasive. After-action reports, which were supposed to provide the operational record of what had occurred during a particular engagement, were written with an awareness of what the reader expected to see. Discrepancies between the written record and the physical evidence of an operation. The number of weapons recovered relative to the number of casualties claimed, for instance, were noted internally and routinely dismissed or explained away. The reliance on metrics that could be manipulated created an environment in which the institutional incentive was always to manipulate them. This was not a secret within the military. Officers who had served in Vietnam discussed it among themselves. Analysts who reviewed the data noted the internal inconsistencies. The problem was structural. The war required evidence of progress, and evidence of progress required numbers. And numbers could be produced regardless of whether the underlying reality they were supposed to reflect was actually changing. The statistics that were briefed to the Secretary of Defense and the President and Congress and the American public represented not a picture of the war, but a picture of what the people producing the statistics were being asked to produce. The actual war, the one in the villages and the rice paddies and the jungle, was proceeding on its own terms, largely unaffected by the reporting. The ninth area concerned the role of the South Vietnamese government and its forces, the ARVN, which American policy consistently presented as more capable and more legitimate than the evidence suggested. The corruption within the South Vietnamese military and government was extensive and well documented within American reporting channels. Commanders who purchased their commissions, who siphoned military supplies for resale, who maintained phantom soldiers on their rosters and pocketed the salaries, who refused to engage the enemy because engagement produced casualties that threatened their political relationships. These things were known. They were documented in advisors' reports and intelligence assessments. They were discussed in classified cables. They were occasionally mentioned in public statements by American officials in ways carefully calibrated to avoid damaging the legitimacy of the government they were supporting. The official position, maintained with considerable institutional discipline, was that the South Vietnamese government and military were improving, that Vietnamization was working, that the transfer of responsibility was proceeding on schedule. The internal record painted a substantially different picture. American advisors who filed honest assessments of ARVN performance and South Vietnamese governmental effectiveness found those assessments unwelcome at higher levels of the command structure. The advisors who prospered were those who found ways to frame a difficult reality in terms that supported the official policy. The gap between what the advisors in the field were seeing and what appeared in the formal evaluations was wide enough that several senior officers who served in advisory roles during this period have described the reporting process as essentially dishonest from the beginning. Not because individual officers were deliberately falsifying documents, but because the entire framing of what constituted a positive assessment had been calibrated to what the policy required, rather than what the facts supported. The 10th area was the systematic underreporting of American casualties and the manipulation of casualty statistics to support the official narrative. The official killed-in-action figures for American forces, while extensively documented compared to enemy or civilian casualty figures, were subject to their own forms of management. The classification of deaths, whether they were attributed to hostile fire, accidents, illness, or other causes, affected how they appeared in public reporting. Deaths that occurred outside the official combat zone, in Laos or Cambodia during operations that were not officially acknowledged, were handled in ways that maintained the concealment of those operations. Soldiers who died during classified operations were sometimes listed under cover designations or with cause of death descriptions that obscured the actual circumstances. The families were sometimes told different things than what appeared in the official records. Wounded soldiers who survived but sustained injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives entered a Department of Veterans Affairs system that was ill-equipped and institutionally reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of service-connected disability. The long-term health consequences of Agent Orange exposure, of post-traumatic stress disorder, of the physical and psychological injuries sustained during service. These things became the subject of a decades-long institutional battle in which veterans were required to prove what the system had every incentive to deny. The treatment of veterans upon return, which included the abrupt termination of any formal support structure from the military and the lack of any serious investment in the transition from combat service to civilian life, produced consequences that extended far beyond the war itself. The soldiers came home, and the institution that had sent them moved on. The 11th area was the psychological deterioration of American forces in the field, which was both documented within medical and psychiatric channels and systematically minimized in official communications. Combat stress reactions, which in contemporary terminology would be understood as acute stress responses and precursors to post-traumatic stress, were widespread and recognized by medical personnel in Vietnam. The military's response was shaped by two competing imperatives. The first was the genuine understanding that treating stress reactions quickly and near the front improved outcomes and allowed soldiers to return to duty faster. The second was the institutional need to maintain the appearance that American forces were psychologically intact and operationally effective. The second imperative frequently overwhelmed the first in terms of how psychiatric casualties were reported and how treatment was structured. Soldiers who were showing signs of serious psychological distress were sometimes returned to duty prematurely because their units needed them. or because acknowledging the psychological toll of the war was itself a form of admission that the war was doing damage that the official narrative could not accommodate. The rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among Vietnam veterans was substantially higher than any previous American military conflict, and the research that eventually established this took decades to complete because the institutional support for conducting it was limited and the institutional interest in the findings was ambivalent. When the American Psychiatric Association finally included post-traumatic stress disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980, it was in part because veterans advocates had pushed for the recognition of a condition that the military had spent the previous decade refusing to formally acknowledge as a service-connected consequence of combat. The soldiers who had been coming apart for years, who had been self-medicating with alcohol and drugs, who had been unable to maintain employment or relationships, who had been dying by suicide at rates that were not tracked systematically and not reported publicly. Those soldiers existed in a space that was outside the official account of what the war had cost. The 12th area involved what happened at the operational and strategic level when the war's purpose became genuinely unclear, which was roughly continuous from the mid-1960s onward, and how that uncertainty was managed in official communications. The stated strategic objectives of the American military involvement in Vietnam underwent a series of adjustments that amounted to a sustained redefinition of what winning meant. When it became clear that earlier definitions of success could not be achieved within the political and resource constraints that existed, the definitions were revised. Objectives that had been explicitly stated were quietly dropped. The rationale for continued involvement shifted from victory to something more like preventing defeat, and then from preventing defeat to something like ensuring a decent interval before the South Vietnamese government collapsed, which was itself not a thing that could be stated publicly, because stating it would have made explicit what was being implicitly acknowledged in classified channels. Soldiers fighting in 1971 and 1972 were fighting for objectives that their commanding officers could not clearly articulate, in a war whose strategic purpose had been revised to the point of incoherence within an institution that was simultaneously trying to maintain operational effectiveness and manage its own disintegration. The 13th area was the treatment of Vietnamese civilians in the context of pacification operations, which were the programs designed to win over the rural population by providing security, economic development, and political legitimacy. The gap between the stated philosophy of pacification and its actual implementation was enormous and well documented in the internal record. The Strategic Hamlet Program, the earlier iteration of pacification, had involved the forced relocation of large numbers of civilians from their home villages into government-controlled settlements, a process that was frequently conducted with minimal regard for the economic, social, and cultural disruption it caused. Villages that had been maintained by families for generations were burned. People were relocated to areas where they had no agricultural land, no social networks, and no economic basis for survival. The official account characterized this as liberating the population from Viet Cong control. The actual experience of the population being relocated was substantially different, and the program's effect on popular support for the South Vietnamese government was the opposite of what it was designed to produce. These outcomes were known to the people administering the program. The reports they filed reflected the official optimism that the program required. Forced displacement of civilians continued through various program iterations throughout the war. The generation of hundreds of thousands of refugees from operations in the countryside was a direct consequence of military activities, including free fire zone designations, large-scale clearing operations, and the simple reality that villages in contested areas were not safe regardless of their inhabitants' political sympathies. The refugee population, which at various points numbered in the millions, represented a form of evidence about the war's effect on Vietnamese civilian life that was difficult to integrate into the official narrative. The refugees were present. They required food and shelter. They were a physical demonstration that the pacification program was not pacifying. The reports about them were filtered through a framework that consistently emphasized the resources being provided and the goodwill of the American effort, and consistently underemphasized the circumstances that had produced the refugees in the first place. The 14th area was the relationship between the press and the military, and the systematic effort to manage information flowing to journalists in ways that shaped the public's understanding of the war. The press corps in Vietnam was unusually large and unusually free by the standards of 20th-century American military conflicts. Journalists could move relatively freely in South Vietnam and could witness and report on operations in ways that would not have been permitted in earlier conflicts. This created a tension that the military managed through a combination of official briefings, access management, social pressure, and the occasional more direct intervention. The 5 o'clock follies, the daily military briefings in Saigon, became famous for the distance between what was being briefed and what journalists who had been in the field that day had seen. The briefings were not intended to inform. They were intended to establish an official version of events that could be cited, that would appear in news reports alongside whatever journalists had actually observed, and that would create enough ambiguity about what had actually happened to prevent any single account from being definitive. Journalists who reported too aggressively on things the military did not want reported faced various forms of pressure. Access was restricted. Sources dried up. Stories that relied on military cooperation became more difficult to pursue. Individual journalists who became identified as hostile to the official narrative found their careers discussed in internal military communications in ways that suggested coordinated management of their access and their relationships with sources. None of this was unique to Vietnam. It represented a form of press management that was common to any large institution interacting with reporters covering it adversarially. What was different in Vietnam was the scale of the gap between what was being managed and the underlying reality, which meant that the management apparatus was working against the flow of evidence rather than merely shaping its presentation. The 15th area was the series of events and decisions surrounding the fall of the South Vietnamese government in 1975 and the way those events were framed in American official communications. The fall of Saigon was presented publicly as a sudden and unexpected development that reflected the failure of the South Vietnamese military to defend itself despite American support. The internal record told a different story. American analysts had been documenting the deterioration of the South Vietnamese military and government for years. The aid reductions that followed the Paris Peace Accords had been understood internally as potentially decisive. The likelihood of a North Vietnamese military victory had been assessed with increasing confidence in the months before it occurred. The public narrative of surprise and South Vietnamese failure obscured the longer history of American assessments that had documented the trajectory clearly. The soldiers who had served in Vietnam and the veterans who had been following the war's progress watched the fall of Saigon with an understanding that it represented the final expression of something that had been building for years, not a reversal of a previously stable situation. The 16th area involves what did not get reported about the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces themselves. The official American characterization of the enemy underwent significant revision over the course of the war, generally in the direction of whatever served the current operational or political requirements. In the early advisory period, the Viet Cong were characterized in ways that minimized their political legitimacy and their popular support. As the war continued and the evidence of widespread civilian support for the Viet Cong in large portions of the countryside became harder to ignore, the characterization shifted toward emphasizing coercion, terror, and the forced nature of that support. The complexity of the actual political situation, in which the Viet Cong represented genuine political forces within South Vietnamese society and had genuine support from significant portions of the population, was not something that the official narrative could accommodate, because accommodating it would have undermined the foundational premise of the American intervention, which was that the South Vietnamese government represented the legitimate aspirations of the Vietnamese people and needed only external support to survive. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces' military effectiveness was also managed carefully in official communications. After early engagements made clear that these were disciplined, well-trained, and highly motivated military forces, the tendency in official communications was to attribute their effectiveness to numerical strength, Chinese and Soviet support, and the geographic advantages of operating in familiar terrain rather than to the political and organizational coherence of a force fighting for objectives its members believed in. The individual soldier on the other side of the fight, his motivations, his experience of the war, his understanding of what he was fighting for, was almost entirely absent from official American communications about the conflict. He appeared as a casualty statistic, as an organizational element in an order of battle, or as an undifferentiated enemy. The fact that he was fighting in ways that indicated high morale, high unit cohesion, and genuine ideological commitment was a fact that the official narrative could not explain within its own framework, and therefore did not dwell on. The 17th area, and in some ways the one that encompassed all the others, was the systematic suppression of any comprehensive accounting of what the war had actually been. This was not accomplished through a single order or a single program. It was accomplished through the accumulated weight of thousands of individual decisions about what to classify, what to amend, what to investigate and what to let die, what to acknowledge and what to deny. The Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the New York Times in 1971, provided a glimpse of how comprehensively the internal record differed from the public account. They were not the full internal record. They were a portion of it, and that portion was damaging enough that the government went to federal court to prevent their publication. The effort to suppress them failed, but the lesson was not lost on those who controlled the broader documentary record. Classification was applied liberally. Documents that might create accountability were handled carefully. The internal histories that the military and the government commissioned about the war were produced, reviewed, and in many cases classified or delayed in ways that ensured they would not affect the public understanding of the war while the war was still being fought or immediately afterward. The soldiers who served in Vietnam and who knew from direct experience what the war had actually been came home to a country that was not prepared to hear it. This was partly because the country was exhausted and divided. It was partly because the institutional machinery that had managed the war's public presentation continued to function, continued to shape how the war was discussed and remembered. It was partly because the honest account of the war implicated not just bad individuals, but functioning institutions, not just operational failures, but systematic policy choices, not just mistakes, but deliberate decisions made by people who knew what they were deciding. The honest account was too large and too distributed to be contained in any single disclosure. It could only be assembled gradually over decades, from the accumulation of declassified documents and historical research and the testimony of people who had been there, most of whom told their stories long after the moment when those stories could change anything. The war ended in the formal sense on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon and the remaining American presence was evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. The body count for American forces was 58,318 killed. The South Vietnamese military lost between 200,000 and 300,000 killed. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong losses remain disputed, with estimates ranging from 600,000 to over 1 million. Vietnamese civilian casualties are estimated at somewhere between 1 and 3 million, with uncertainty at every level of the estimate, including the basic methodological uncertainty introduced by the fact that many of those deaths were not reported to anyone, because the reporting infrastructure did not exist, or because those who might have reported them were also dead, or because the deaths occurred in the context of operations whose true nature was itself not being reported. The unexploded ordnance from the war continued killing people in Vietnam and Laos for decades after the shooting stopped. The dioxin from Agent Orange continued contaminating the land and the water supply and producing birth defects and cancers in the Vietnamese population for decades after the shooting stopped. American veterans continued dying from Agent Orange-related conditions for decades after the shooting stopped. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, had formally ended direct American military involvement. The accords included provisions for the release of American prisoners of war, which occurred, and provisions for a political settlement between North and South Vietnam, which did not occur because the underlying military and political dynamic that the accords were supposed to resolve had not actually been resolved. The agreement was presented publicly as peace with honor, a phrase that required the audience to accept both that the outcome was peaceful and that it was honorable. And the audience was asked to do this while watching helicopters evacuate the last Americans from Saigon 2 years later, which made the framing difficult to maintain. The soldiers who had served and come home years earlier watched this and understood it as the final official confirmation of something they had been carrying privately for years. The war had not accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. The reporting had not reflected what the war had actually been. The accounting had not accounted for what had actually happened. The official record was a record of the war that the institution had needed to fight, rather than the war that had actually been fought. In the years after 1975, the classified documentation of the war began to be declassified in pieces through mandatory review processes and Freedom of Information Act requests and the periodic decisions of administrations to release particular categories of material. Historians working through the National Archives encountered documents that contradicted the official account at almost every level. The suppressed intelligence estimates, the falsified operational reports, the classified cables documenting corruption and dysfunction in the South Vietnamese government, the internal assessments of the pacification program, the medical and psychiatric records documenting the psychological toll of the war on American forces, the records of operations in Laos and Cambodia, the records of the Phoenix program, the records of interrogation practices, the records of civilian casualty assessments that had been conducted internally and then classified. These documents were assembled gradually into a historical record that was substantially different from the public account. But that record was assembled after the fact, read by historians and researchers and former participants, and rarely translated into anything that changed the general public understanding of the war in a fundamental way. The soldiers who had carried the knowledge of what the war had actually been, who had filed the reports that disappeared, who had witnessed the events that were reclassified, who had been told explicitly or implicitly not to speak about what they had seen. Those soldiers were old men by the time the documentary record began to catch up with their experience. Some of them talked, some of them wrote, some of them testified in various forums over the decades. The institution that had trained them and deployed them and ordered them not to speak about certain things had, in a formal sense, moved on. The military had drawn its lessons from Vietnam, or said it had, and had restructured itself and had fought subsequent wars. The particular men who had made the decisions to suppress particular reports had retired or died. The chain of accountability that would have connected the decision to the consequence had been broken by time and by the institutional management of memory. What remained was a gap. The gap between what the war had been and what the official record said it was. The gap between what the soldiers had experienced and what had been reported. The gap between the numbers and the reality the numbers were supposed to measure. The gap between the stated purpose and the actual purpose, which had been revised so many times that the original version was barely legible in the later documentation. That gap did not close when the war ended. It did not close when the documents were declassified. It did not close when the memorials were built, or the histories were written, or the documentaries were produced. It remained there, in the texture of the historical record, in the places where the official account grew thin or changed direction without explanation, in the footnotes that reference classified annexes and the archival boxes marked restricted, and the testimony of men who had been there and described something different than what the reports described. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973. The last American prisoner of war returned home in February of that year. The South Vietnamese government continued to exist for 2 more years, supported by American aid that declined and then stopped, fighting a war that had been in the American public mind already over, while the soldiers fighting it understood that the political decision had been made and the military outcome was a matter of time. The war did not stop when the decision to stop was made. It continued through its own momentum, through the military organizations that had been built to fight it and had no other purpose, through the political commitments that had created obligations that could not be immediately dissolved, through the physical presence of millions of tons of weapons and ammunition and military infrastructure that would take years to exhaust or destroy or abandon. The American involvement had a formal ending date. The war itself had a different kind of ending, quieter, longer, and more complicated than any official account was positioned to acknowledge. On the morning of April 30th, 1975, as North Vietnamese tanks moved through the streets of Saigon, there were still American civilians inside the embassy compound, waiting for evacuation helicopters that had been running all night and were still running. The last helicopter left the embassy roof at approximately 7:47 in the morning. By that point, the war had been over for Americans in the political sense for more than 2 years. The soldiers who had fought in it had been home for years. The official statistics had been compiled. The reports had been filed. The records had been classified or retained or destroyed according to the institutional procedures that governed such things. The war ended, and the accounting of it continued in the places where accounting is possible, which is to say incompletely, and in the places where it is not, which is to say everywhere else. In 1979, the Department of Defense released a study indicating that approximately 800,000 Vietnam veterans were experiencing significant readjustment problems. That number was understood at the time to be an undercount. The study's own authors acknowledged methodological limitations that made precision impossible. The veterans experiencing those problems were not, for the most part, in any official record as experiencing those problems. They were managing privately or not managing, and what was happening to them was happening outside the systems that were supposed to track it. The war had produced consequences that the official record could not fully see, in the same way that it had produced events that the official record could not fully report. The shape of the thing was larger than what could be contained in the documentation. The documentation was a record of what the institution had been able to acknowledge, and acknowledgement had always been selective. The bombing of Laos, when the full scale of it was finally documented, made it the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Over 2 million tons of ordnance were dropped over 9 years. More than 30% of the bombs did not detonate on impact. They remained in the soil, and they continued killing people decades after the last American aircraft had returned to its base. The people they killed were not in any American casualty count. They were not in any American report. They were outside the frame of what the war, in its official American form, had included. They continued dying, and the accounting of their deaths was someone else's problem in an accounting system that did not connect to the one that had produced the original bombs. The war in Vietnam was not unique in producing this kind of gap between reality and official record. It was not unique in producing institutional suppression of inconvenient facts, or systematic misrepresentation of operational outcomes, or the management of information to protect policy and careers and the legitimacy of the institutions involved. What made it distinctive was the scale and the duration and the particular moment in American history at which it occurred, when the mechanisms of public scrutiny were strong enough to document the gap, but not strong enough to close it in real time. The soldiers who served in it understood, most of them at some level, that what they were being asked to report and what they were experiencing were different things. They carried that understanding home with them. Some of them said so. Most of them did not, or not in terms that found their way into any official record. The official record reflected the war the institution had needed to fight. The war that was actually fought was recorded elsewhere, in the bodies of the men who had fought it, in the land they had fought over, in the gap between what was reported and what had happened, which remained open long after the last report was filed.